Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. It's Richard Lawrence with Agile for All. This week, our featured Scrum Foundations video was on retrospectives, so I'm going to be answering questions, taking more questions on retrospectives. I've got a nice list from our recent classes in the last couple weeks and some conversations online, so that'll get us going. But if you're watching this live on Facebook or YouTube, leave a comment and we'll be watching that for your questions or the topics that you want to talk about. All right, so we're talking about retrospectives. So probably a good place to start is to level set on the purpose. Why do we do these things? And then that will drive the answers to a lot of the questions I get about it. I think most people can agree that retrospectives are about continuous improvement, but it matters what we're improving towards. What is the end of our continuous improvement? I think in an attempt to motivate a team to want to really dig in and do a good retro, somebody in a Scrum Master role who is just fired up about the idea of improvement sells that as the purpose. And to the team member, that can feel like, we're going to figure out a way to exploit me more effectively and efficiently. And so I like to make sure the purpose is something that's actually meaningful to everyone involved, and then we can collaborate around that. So from my perspective, the purpose of the retrospective is continuous improvement to two related ends. First off, it's about improving so that we can have a greater impact as a team on our customers, our organization, ultimately on the world, because everybody wants their life and work to matter. So the retrospective is a time for us to figure out how can we make our work matter more. And then the other side of it, which is related, is continuous improvement to improve the ease of work. And this is a phrase I got from Taiichi Ohno, the father of the Toyota production system, where he talks about their continuous improvement is oriented towards ease of work. Like finding those things that are making the work more difficult than it needs to be. Things that are getting in the way, those things that are frustrating and demotivating, and getting them out of the way, which is naturally going to lead to improvement in output, and potentially, if your output is directed in the right direction, improvement in impact. So the two are related, and it ends up improving autonomy, mastery, purpose for the people on the team, which are the three things that are required for intrinsic motivation. So my first bit of advice around retrospectives is make sure that everything you do in a retrospective is oriented towards improving towards greater impact and improving towards greater ease of work. Not just, if you ask a general question of like what worked or what didn't, and you don't have that purpose in mind, you can identify things that worked towards some other goal. But we want to make sure it's all about greater impact, greater ease of work. If you're just joining us, I see people trickling in here. We are talking about retrospectives, answering your questions about retrospectives this week. So if you've got some challenge you're running into with your team, if your retrospectives don't seem to work as well as you'd like, if they're boring or ineffective, add your question on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter. We're watching all those channels for questions, so go wherever's easiest for you and send a message to Agile for All or RS Lawrence on Twitter, or comment on one of our posts about this or the live stream itself. So lots of places where you can add your questions and get them answered in the next 30 or 40 minutes as we talk about this. Great. See questions coming in right now, including a channel I didn't think about, which is our Humanizing Work community. Humanizing Work is an event that we put on every summer up in the mountains in Colorado here for people who've been in our introductory classes like CSM, CSPO, Agile for Teams. And we do a sort of conference. We've stopped calling it a conference because companies seem to think of conferences as vaguely work-related parties. And while we have a good time here, it's intense training for 3 days. And we do product owner, Scrum Master coach, and leader tracks with lots of great content. And most of the Agile for All team is there teaching at the same time. So it's good stuff. And we have a Slack community from people who've been to the last 4 Humanizing Work events. And I've got some questions coming in from there. So I'm going to add those to my list, and we will get to them a little bit later in this. All right. So let's see. Who should be there? So I've got several questions around the participants. So the retrospective, and we're talking in a Scrum context now, although you can use retrospectives in other contexts. For example, I facilitate quarterly or annual retrospectives for a few of our clients to look at a whole business unit or a whole organization and how has the last year gone. And so that's a different thing. We can get to other retrospectives if there's interest around that, but talking particularly about the sprint retrospective in Scrum, who should be there? So from my perspective, it's for the Scrum team. Notice I didn't say the development team. Scrum has this team within a team thing, for better or worse. Not my favorite naming, but it's for the team. So a question I get a lot is, should the product owner be there? And my answer is almost unequivocally yes. Yes, the product owner should be there. Because if your goal is to optimize your work towards greater impact, the product owner is a key part of that system, because they're the one helping point the team in a particular direction, and their work has a huge effect on how much impact the team's work has. If the product owner is pointing the team in the wrong direction, it doesn't matter how good the development team gets at doing development if they're building the wrong thing really well. So the collaboration between the product owner and the rest of the Scrum team is a critical part of the Scrum team's effectiveness. So yeah, they should be there. There's often a follow-up question implicit in that. It usually takes the form of something like, but my developers won't speak up if the product owner's in the room. Right? And when you dig into that, there's some kind of organizational power difference, like the product owner is in a organizational leadership role, and it seems like it'd be difficult for a developer to say something about, that expresses vulnerability and a need to improve. And I get that. That's a real thing. Safety is important for being able to reflect and genuinely improve. The trouble is, if you look at that team and like what's their constraint on maximizing their effectiveness, I'd be willing to bet it's the collaboration with the product owner. So if there's not trust and safety in that relationship, it's not just showing up in the retro. That's going to be showing up all over the place, and I suspect that is the thing that the team needs to work on. So if you feel like you can't have your product owner in your retrospective because it wouldn't be safe, you found the thing you need to have a retrospective about. Now, maybe you need to get an outside facilitator, maybe another coach or Scrum Master in your organization, maybe an outside facilitator like one of the Agile for All coaches. You bring in somebody else to make it safe for everyone to participate and really deal with that difficult issue. But if you don't deal with that issue, you're going to end up with retrospectives that are kind of improvement theater, where you're going through the motions of improving, but you're not talking about the big issue for the team. So yeah, the product owner should absolutely be there. I have several other questions about who should be there. Should managers and executives be there? Generally, no. Because it's for the Scrum team, I would say we should not have, particularly managers of developers or whatever in the room. Keep it to the team. Now, there are exceptions to that. Most of the time, your sprint retrospective is going to be a general conversation about what's going on with our team right now, what's holding us back, how do we want to improve. From time to time, the Scrum Master or others on the team may have some intuition about a particular issue that relates to something that's bigger than the team. Like maybe you have functional managers who are uncertain of their role in this new Agile way of working, and they're getting into the team's work in some ways that might have made sense in an old way of working but are now impeding the team's effectiveness. Rather than getting together and talking about these managers and the way they're interfering, I would suggest inviting them in and having a retrospective that's different from the usual one. So you don't just go through the usual one and hope you land on that topic, but you have an improvement-focused conversation that's specifically about the interactions between the Scrum team and these close stakeholders, like a functional manager or a business partner that the product owner collaborates with, or a support team that maybe you've had some trouble collaborating with in the last sprint. Whatever it is, you can occasionally bring in outside people for a particular retrospective. Angelo on the Humanizing Work community asked a variation on this one. What about a feature retrospective that would involve other parts of the business? That sounds a bit more like a review to me. If you're looking at the state of the product, looking at this feature and reflecting on what it means, and that's a review, and those you definitely want to invite a wider audience. Now, if you're talking about a retrospective along the lines of not looking at the feature, the chunk of work itself, but what does that work tell us about us, and what can we learn going into the next feature, I could see some benefit in doing a multi-team or a team plus stakeholders, or some kind of larger chunk of the business getting together and reflecting on how did we collaborate as we built this thing, and how can we improve that in the future. That's kind of what I end up doing when I facilitate a quarterly or annual retrospective for a whole product group or IT department or something, where we're looking at the larger organization and interactions between individuals and teams in there. And so I think that's a great thing to do. That doesn't replace the sprint retrospective, which is the Scrum team optimizing for greater impact and ease. So I would keep those things separate. And it's fine. Scrum doesn't describe everything you should do in an organization. It's a minimal set of coordination points about some key things for a team that works together every day. But there's going to be other collaboration points around the edges related to the product and the organizational system that you're still going to need to do. Should the customer be there was another question I got. And my initial reaction when I saw this one was, I come from an extreme programming background before I got into Scrum. So in 99 to about 2003, 2004, I was focused on just extreme programming, and now I take XP practices into Scrum. But at that time, customer was the synonym for product owner, and they were in the room with the team, and customer was really close. So in that sense, my first thought was, yeah, of course the customer should be in there. But thinking about the way people would mean that on a Scrum team in 2018, customer is the end user or the buyer, not the product owner in most cases. And my answer to that would be similar to the way I've answered the other ones about roles is, if they're not on the Scrum team, they shouldn't be in the retrospective automatically, but from time to time, it may be useful to have a retrospective focused on a particular part of your larger organizational system. And in that case, you might pull in the customer and do some reflection on how did we collaborate with the customer over this last release or something. But generally, no, keep it to the Scrum team and only bring in other people by invitation for particular conversations you need to have. Looking looking over the list of questions here, thinking about where to go next. Let's talk about timing. A few questions about length and frequency. One of them says, the Scrum Guide says up to 3 hours for a 1 month sprint. And then it says 3 hours with like exclamations and question marks. I think the implication there is that is a really long time. To which I would say a 1 month sprint is a really long time. And first off, you probably shouldn't be doing a 1 month sprint. Yeah, I'll say that again. A 1 month sprint is probably too long. The only reason that I can think of to have a 1 month sprint is that you have work that for some reason can't be sliced into small increments such that you could fit 6 to 10 of them in a 1 week sprint. And as you know, if you followed my work for any length of time, one of my favorite things to talk about is slicing work. And I've had a challenge out since 2008 in public when I first wrote the Patterns for Splitting User Stories article to bring me the unsplittable software story. And we still haven't really found one a decade later. So the one reason that you could have a 1 month sprint, which is items that can't be sliced, I don't think actually turns out to be a reason in practice. So you probably should be running a shorter sprint. But that's not really the question. The question is, how long should the retrospective be relative to the sprint? And so 3 hours on a 1 month sprint, is 45 minutes per week of sprint. That doesn't feel crazy long. There a lot of things can happen in a month that you'd want to reflect on. I think a well-facilitated retrospective for a 1 month sprint could be done in 60 to 90 minutes. So 3 hours is probably the outside time box. If it really takes that long, something was wrong. I think it could be facilitated better than that and only take an hour, hour and a half. And that's pretty much my rule of thumb for even a 2 week sprint. 45 minutes to an hour is probably enough time to have some good reflection, but not feel like you're belaboring it and boring everybody and wearing everybody out. So that comes down to good facilitation, and I've got some questions about facilitation queued up for a little bit later in this conversation. So we will get there. Just pulling in some questions from a few different sources here. All right. Another one related to timing frequency. Does it have to happen every sprint? Well, I think one of the key benefits in Scrum is that you have an opportunity to reflect and adjust in small increments. You're not making huge changes, you're making small changes. And then the small changes accumulate into big effects at the end. So I would recommend not skipping retrospectives. Do it every sprint. I suspect the thing that makes you want to do it less often is that they feel ineffective or boring, and that's usually a facilitation problem when we get to the root cause, so we're going to come back around to that later. But I would say do them regularly and make small changes. And as my colleague Agile Bob likes to say, you get 2% better every sprint, and you're running 2 week sprints, you're twice as good at the end of the year because of compounding. So lots of small changes add up, and I would prefer that to every so often we have to make a massive change because we only do retros every 2 or 3 sprints or even less. And I rarely run into people who would say with a straight face that we've stopped improving. Like, we just really don't need them. We're as good as we can be. And it's the teams that are really good are ones that actually want to do retrospectives more often and in smaller increments. The ones who want to do it less are usually somewhat mediocre but feel stuck and don't know what to do. And we mix up ability and motivation in our brains a lot. So if we don't know how to do something well, we'll convince ourselves it's not worth doing. And so retrospectives aren't working. Well, let's do fewer of them. But I kind of like the continuous delivery approach here of if it hurts, do it more often and get good at it. So if retrospectives aren't working, let's do a retrospective as often as we can and figure out how to make it good. How do we make it less boring? So I think there's a good and bad way to approach this problem. The most common way I see people try to approach the boring retrospective problem is by adding novelty and games and activities, and it doesn't usually work. It just means now we're bored, but we feel like we're doing some silly activity while we're bored. So that's my least favorite way to try to spice it up. I think a more effective way to make any meeting less boring is to make the meeting more effective. People are motivated to talk about things that matter, that have an impact in their life and work. So boring is a signal that we're doing things that don't seem to be connected to things that matter to us. So I would say do things to make it matter. So this is probably a good time to talk about what I teased in my messages earlier this week, that I think the standard retrospective format, and I don't know how this became a standard, but the most common retrospective format I see in the wild is, I think, almost perfectly optimized to become boring and ineffective in about 4 or 5 sprints. Let's explain why. The standard retrospective format that I run into, sort of de facto standard, I don't know anybody teaching like this is the official way, is what we sometimes call plus minus delta. What worked, what didn't, what do we want to change or try? Okay. The plus minus delta retrospective is what I call the training wheels of good retrospection. And that might make you think, okay, so we do that for a while and we get better. But here's the catch. Training wheels teach you how not to ride a bicycle while looking like you're riding a bicycle. Training wheels teach a kid's brain the exact opposite mechanics of what it takes to keep a bike upright, while giving them the sense that they're riding a bike. Like, I'm a big kid now. I'm out here riding with all the other kids on my big kid bike, not on a tricycle anymore, right? But then you take the training wheels off and you send Junior down the sidewalk and they fall over. And if you can get them brushed off, they maybe fell over in the grass, get them going again. And you just repeat that until you've essentially unlearned everything that they learned while they were using the training wheels. Because they were learning to turn away from a fall, and you need to actually turn into a fall, because wheels work like a gyroscope and bring it back up. So if the plus minus delta retrospective is the training wheels of retrospection, what I mean is that it looks a lot like we're having these deep reflective improvement conversations as a team when we're actually teaching ourselves how not to. Because when you first start with a team and you adopt that format, maybe you've come out of some kind of team formation or training event like one of our Agile for Teams workshops. At that point, the issues that you have as a team and the opportunities for improvement are sitting right on the surface. So when you ask a question like, what worked, what went well, people can answer that in a way that other people on the team would agree to, because you see it together. You know what good looks like at that point, and you can see what's aligned with that. And you ask what didn't work or what didn't go well, and people can see the things that got in the way because they know what they wanted to do. You know, what do we want to try? I mean, you've got this list of 10 things that you know you want to do, and you vote on those and you feel like, yeah, we're improving. And I mean, to be fair, you are improving at that point, just like the kid on the training wheels really is riding around with his friends who are on bikes without training wheels. But then you get 4 or 5 sprints in and you've dealt with the things that were on the surface, and now you're below the surface. At that point, no one person has all the data, and certainly everybody doesn't have all the data you would need to answer a question like, what went well? What's working? So you ask what went well and you get answers like, that was great when we had bagels on Tuesday. Does that have anything to do with our greater impact or ease of work? I mean, maybe through a long chain of cause and effect and higher morale and things like that, but really that's probably not the constraint. It's like, do we have enough bagels to make our team effective? You ask what didn't work, and somebody says, I had some problems with my development environment, but I think that only affected me. So it's trivial or personal things. So what I suggest instead is using something called the focus conversation method. See if I have it in my bookcase here. Yep. So this is the single most useful facilitation resource I recommend to anybody. A book called The Art of Focused Conversation. And The Art of Focused Conversation teaches a way of structuring any meeting, but it's particularly useful for retrospectives. It has you structure your meeting into 4 kinds of discussion. You ask some questions or you do different activities to do 4 kinds of things. And the book is a great one because it's got something like 48 pages on how to do the method. And then most of the book back here is 100 some examples of focused conversation. So you can see what it looks like in different contexts. So the structure is like this. The first thing you do is observation. You get shared data. And for a retrospective, the Scrum Master can bring a lot of this. Things like, what did we plan? What did we actually deliver? What did our progress look like throughout the sprint? Maybe there's a cumulative flow diagram or something that you could bring in. What kind of feedback did we get? What impediments did we run into? Just facts about who was in and out. What issues came up that took our attention. Basically any of the facts. And if you're in person, I love putting these on the wall. So you make the bulletin board kind of thing, like on one of those detective shows where they have all the facts up there connected by string. And I've never used string, but I think that'd be cool. But in any case, you get all the things on the wall. And then I would ask the team, everybody in the room, what else happened? What other facts are we missing up here that might be relevant when we try to make sense of what's going on with our team? And you get other ideas up there. And this is all data. People can agree to this. There's no debate. It's not, that was a fact for me, but not for you. I have alternative facts. That's not how observation works. This is what things actually happened that we can agree to. And if we debate it, we're debating the existence of the thing, not the meaning of the thing, or how we feel about it, or any of that. It's just, what are the facts? Okay. That, if you come prepared, you can get that done in about the first 5 minutes of the meeting, and then you've got this big shared visual of the facts. Second kind of discussion the art of focused conversation says to have is reflection. Reflection is where we talk about our internal state relative to the facts. So yeah, this could be a conversation about feelings, but if you go directly there with a technical team, it's not usually effective. So my favorite way to get at this with a team of people who are not already comfortable talking about what's going on inside them is to talk about motivation. So I'll ask, when were you particularly motivated? What are you excited about that's on these facts up here? We might give people blue dots to vote on those things. Where vote on the things that you feel happiest or excited or motivated by. And then we might give everybody a couple red dots and say, what are the things that you're frustrated or demotivated, discouraged by? Mark those things. And then that becomes part of the data. Right, so now we have not just what happened, but how do we feel about the things that happened without having to talk about our feelings in an awkward way, just acknowledging our internal state towards the things on the wall, which keeps it from getting buried and then coming up later in a dysfunctional way when somebody's crying or yelling about something that doesn't seem like it warrants that. That's usually a sign that we've been burying something, and then somebody makes some proposal that is just takes it too far. So let's build it into the facts. Then the third part is interpretation. That's where we get to the questions like what worked, what didn't, what's going well, or better yet, more oriented towards impact and ease. We could say what things helped the work get done? What things hindered the work from getting done? What things increased the impact we had in this sprint? What things diminished the impact we were able to have in this sprint? So it keeps it really focused. It's not just good or bad, but it's good or bad towards a purpose. So the standard plus minus delta approach makes the mistake of jumping straight into the interpretation step, skipping the observation and reflection steps, which means you don't have that pool of shared data to work from. And I argue from my facts, you argue from your facts, and we probably would be more aligned if we had the same facts. Okay, so we do the observation, and this usually leads the team to finding the one thing that is holding them back the most, the one constraint. And then we get to the fourth part, which is decision. What are we going to do about it? And usually there's one clear experiment that you end up proposing. So it's not like a list of things to try that you have to vote on or debate. This builds alignment on a team towards one thing that you want to do. And then you put the experiment in a useful place to make sure it happens, and you go do your thing. And this approach is why I suggested that you could do even a month worth of retrospection in an hour to an hour and a half. If you have a focused conversation, not a rambling conversation, it works really well. So this focused conversation structure, sometimes called ORID structure for observation, reflection, interpretation, decision, is a great way to structure any meeting, but particularly retrospectives. If you have the Agile Retrospectives book by Esther Derby and Diana Larson, it essentially follows the same structure. In fact, I learned focused conversation from Esther years ago. And so if they've got 5 parts, they've got that, like the setting the stage, and kind of break it out a little bit differently, but you can look at Agile Retrospectives and take some of those activities and see where they can plug into the focused conversation structure, and have kind of a combination of things you would pick up from that book and things you would pick up from the focused conversation book or other sources for facilitation resources. The structure works for lots of different things. A question I often get is, how do we make sure the action items actually happen out of the retrospective? So I mentioned a moment ago, just take your experiment and put it somewhere. Well, it turns out that there's about 4 different places where a retrospective outcome could go. And people often forget about this or put things in the wrong place. So what are the 4 places you could put a retrospective action? First, if it's something you could start and finish, like it's a task or it's something you would do, like making a change to your build server, or going out and having a particular conversation with somebody, or usually it's technical improvements, but it's a one-time thing you could start and finish. Put that on your sprint backlog in your next sprint plan to make sure you leave time for it and prioritize it accordingly. So that's the first one, sprint backlog. If it's something that you wouldn't start and finish, but it's more about how you want to work together as a team, like we've agreed to maybe do a stories talk daily scrum rather than a people talk daily scrum. Ask me later if you don't know what that means. So if you decide to do a stories talk daily scrum, you might put that on your working agreement, as this is a thing we're going to do as a team. We're going to focus our daily scrum around the work that we're doing rather than showing our busyness. That's not something you would start and finish, so it doesn't make sense on the sprint backlog. It's something that sits alongside your team's work and says, as we work, here's how we want to do it together. So that's the second one, working agreement. Third one is your definition of done. Your outcome of your retrospective might be a change to testing, documentation, something like that is more about tasks you need to add to any backlog item that makes it into your sprint. And in that case, definition of done is the right place. And the fourth place something might go is an individual's to-do list outside of the development team. So the development team's to-do list is pretty much the sprint backlog, but if the Scrum Master or product owner or some stakeholder manager, somebody else takes a to-do item out of the retrospective, it would go on their own personal list. So whether you put this in the sprint backlog, working agreement, definition of done, or an individual to-do list, make sure that that is part of the data in your next retrospective. Like, this was the thing we intended to do. What things happened relative to that? Observation around that. How do we feel about it? What does it mean? You can go through that whole ORID structure on even just that item, or include it in the larger discussion. Okay. Few more things here. Our retrospective is a nasty meeting where everyone is blaming everyone else. How do we stop that? Your retrospective should focus on the system of work. Right? We're not focusing on individuals and what's wrong with them. We're focusing on the system of work. So a basic assumption going into this is, we're assuming that everybody wants to do the right thing. Everybody's well-intentioned. And when people don't do what turns out to be the right thing, right, we assume that they intended to, but something in the system made the wrong thing seem like the right thing. Somebody made that decision because they had good reasons to do it. So how do we change our system so that our decisions are aligned with the things we want to have happen? Now, even if it is a people problem or an individual problem, if you start by assuming it is, you don't have many options. You're stuck with just, what do I do with this broken person? But if you start by assuming that the people want to do the right thing and the system leads to suboptimal behavior, you give yourself more options to experiment and to create more sustainable fixes. So I encourage you to focus on the system. If you built some habits around blaming, you might need a third-party facilitator in there to help you just build some new habits of focusing on the system. So I would encourage you to do this even within your organization. We have a few clients where Scrum Masters sort of have a buddy system where they know if they need to be a participant in a retrospective, it's really hard to facilitate and participate at the same time. So they've paired up with other teams' Scrum Masters and will invite the other one in to facilitate, and the team knows that this is their standard external facilitator, and that works both directions, which gives you, without major investment or ramp up at the beginning of the retrospective to build trust or anything like that. You just have somebody else that you can bring in for these more difficult ones. And you might even have a conversation specifically on that behavior on our team and say, what might be causing that? And how do we feel about it? And what does it mean? And what do we want to do about it? So you could do a focused conversation focused specifically on that issue, and especially if you have a good third-party facilitator to do it. Why do it if we keep having the same problems? I had a conversation with a client this week about it, where their retrospective every time kept coming back to the same problem with an outside third party that they couldn't influence. And they were being told, like, you can't do anything about that. I know that's your problem, but we can't fix it. And it was really demotivating for the team to keep hearing that they can't fix the thing that they knew was the biggest issue. So you got a few options at that point. One option is to figure out how could we make it more visible. I tell people this all the time. If you can't fix it, make it more visible. So you might work together as a team to say, this seems to be more painful to us than it is to the people who can do something about it. How do we, this sounds bad, but how do we share the pain? How do we make it more visible, the impact that this is having? Because we may see something about that negative impact that other people don't see. So how could we help them see what's going on here so that they might be more inclined to find something to do about it? And this would be kind of a different angle for the team to rally around the problem. We can't make it go away, but how could we make it more likely that somebody who could make it go away makes it go away? That's one option. Another option is to treat it as just a thing that exists and figure out how to work within that. For example, So I do downhill mountain biking, which means I do downhill mountain bike crashing. That's just kind of a part of the sport. If I were to do a retrospective on a crash, I could well end up blaming gravity or rocks or trees for my crash, but I'm not likely to be able to do anything about those. There's constraints that you can affect, and there's constraints that are just kind of part of your world. Sometimes policies, sometimes physical constraints. And so if every time I crashed, I got upset at gravity, I would probably not improve as a writer. So if I want to get better, I need to treat gravity as just a thing that exists and I can't do anything about it, and say, given that constraint, how can I maximize my effectiveness? What do I need to do differently? So if nothing changes because there's something outside of your control, you might need to treat that thing as the equivalent of gravity and just say, how can we maximize our impact given this difficult thing in our world? And you just let it be for now, and you find ways to improve. So you don't have every retrospective coming back to, yep, that's our problem still. You also don't pretend it's not your problem. You acknowledge it as a thing, and then you work out how can we maximize our effectiveness working around it or working within it. The other possibility, if you keep having the same problems, it may be that you're just not closing the loop very well on your retrospectives. And so then it would be use those 4 places I mentioned earlier: sprint backlog, working agreement, definition of done, individual to-do lists, to make sure your action items are captured in a clear way. Maybe get better at experiment design so that you can come up with a really clear hypothesis and test and actually run a solid experiment. Maybe you're just not experimenting effectively. So I would look at that too. If it's a problem under your control, but you're not doing anything about it, it's probably something like that. Let's see what else we got here. I saw some more questions come in. All right, a couple more. How do I get people to speak up? On one side, and there's another question: how do I get opinionated people to stop dominating the conversation? So we want some people to speak up, we want some people to speak less, because we have uneven participation. What's typically happening on there is you've got a mix of introverts and extroverts on a team. The introverts probably need some internal processing time before they feel like they have something they want to share. The extroverts are probably processing out loud and stepping on top of the introverts' internal processing. So one of my favorite ways to even things out is to separate writing and sharing. So I'll have people, say, grab 1 or 2 sticky notes, and I'll say, write down what you think is the top constraint revealed by the data we've got on the wall here, or what's one thing you want to make sure we keep that you think is amplifying our effectiveness, and then give people time to sit on it, a couple minutes, write down some notes. Then I might not even collect those sticky notes. I might then just open it up to a conversation, but then the introverts have had time to think and get their thoughts together. The extroverts have been slowed down a little bit and have done some of their processing, and now everybody's on a little bit more equal footing. Now, the verbal processors, they were maybe put behind there. So the other alternative is to do talk with a pair and process it there, and then share what came out of your discussion. So basically the bottom line is, don't always do things as one big group conversation, because that prioritizes a certain mode of thinking and sharing. But mix it up, do some things in writing, do some things silently, do some things in pairs and small groups, do some things with the large group. And I think you'll find you get more even participation. Occasionally you get one person who's really opinionated, has an agenda, and just steps all over other people. And from time to time, I find I need to have a one-on-one conversation with that person outside the meeting to help them understand the impact they're having and maybe ask for their help in getting other people to be able to talk more. So one of my favorite moves there is, I observe that you're usually the first one to speak up, and there are many people in the room that never speak up at all. Would you be willing to do an experiment in the next retrospective where you always let somebody else answer first and then you're free to jump in, and just slow them down a little bit and get them to allow somebody else to speak up? Now, one thing I don't usually like in my facilitation, I see this occasionally, is going around the room and making everybody answer a question. I don't really enjoy putting people on the spot because it's typically not effective. Makes people uncomfortable and feel kind of unsafe there, and it often leads to people not listening to each other as they think about what they're going to say when it's their turn. So that's not my preference, but if I'm facilitating, I will pay attention to the nonverbal communication in the room that may indicate that a otherwise quiet person has something they want to say, but they might not be saying it. So I might actually call on them and ask, do you have something to add here? Or what do you think about that? But only when I have a sense that they do think something about it that they might want to share, and I'm going to ask it in a way that makes it safe for them to say no and pass on it. But sometimes somebody just needs to be asked, and so if I'm seeing some indication they would respond well when they're asked, I'll let that happen. Couple last questions before we wrap up here. Can we combine it with the sprint review? Or can we combine it with sprint planning? And my advice here is don't combine meetings. Have a clear start and purpose, and have a clear finish where you've achieved the purpose or acknowledged you can't and made a plan to achieve the purpose some other way. But don't try to achieve multiple purposes at the same time, because one of those will tend to win and the other will get squeezed out. So it'll be bad for the review or the retro if you try to combine the two. Have a clear start and finish to a review where you've reviewed the state of the product, and then have a clear start and finish to the retrospective where you're looking at your system of work and finding ways to improve that. But don't squish the two together into a review/retro. Of course, you can have it in the same room back to back, but I would go through the formality of inviting people to 2 meetings in the same place back to back, having a short break between, and having a really clear start and finish to each of them when you facilitate it. It just gives a sense of we were effective. We're not sitting in a meeting forever. We set out to solve a problem and we solved it. And remove some of the boredom and unfocusedness associated with meetings. All right, I think that is everything I've got on retrospectives right now. If you have additional questions, maybe you're watching this later, as a lot of people do. Maybe you had your daily scrum during this time. No worries. Add your questions to the comments on the video after it gets shared as a, not a live stream, I guess. And we'll see if we can get those in future live streams or blog posts or other formats. You have a great opportunity here to drive what things we talk about. So until next time, have a great week and find ways to have greater impact and ease of work with your team. Hope your next retrospective is the best one you have yet. See you next time.